My title is somewhat presumptuous. Why? On the one hand, just looking through the names of people who are listening today, whom a lot of them I have to thank for a lot of input I got into this book, plus for their exciting writings about other aspects of urban culture in the late Ottoman Empire. It seems a bit too much to say, like, I'm the one writing about port cities of the Eastern Mediterranean. Nobody else has ever written about them. That's not what I'm trying to imply here, of course. Instead, why I must say I accepted this title. This was something the publishing house pushed for. They don't like too flowery titles. They like straightforward titles. Why I said, like, yes, I can write a book about the port cities of the Eastern Mediterranean, even though it's not the first. It's hopefully also not the last book on the subject, is because I thought that while we have in the last 25 years had great studies about all kinds of aspects of urban life around the Eastern Mediterranean in the 19th and early 20th century, there are some points where I think we have to, as urban historians, as cultural historians, push ourselves a little bit further in the things we say. And why is that? Because when it comes to sort of seminal works about the 19th century, people don't really turn to us. People don't listen to us. And in part, that, of course, has a long history in itself, but is also to some degree, I would say, our fault. Why is that? I would say, sorry, that part of our problem is that we have not really put our things out there in a way that we talk to the major discussions in the history of the late Ottoman Empire, the Mediterranean, Southeast Europe, and other related fields. So if you look at a photograph like this taken somewhere in the end of the 19th century on the quays of Izmir, we will see these various men, pedestrians along the quays. What can we sort of judge about a more general assumption by looking at them? Well, we can study their dress. If you have the picture in big in front of you, you will see there are some people turning their backs to the camera, dressed in baggy pants, wide coats, with thick kerchiefs around their faces, so more traditional, if you so want. You have this person walking towards us who is dressed in perfectly Western suit. So you could say, okay, it's a clash of culture, these people in the old-fashioned dress, this guy in this European dress. But then you see the older gentleman walking next to him, which manages to blend, for example, the lengthy coat and the fez with Western-style trousers. You have even further to the right on the screen, this other person walking there with very tightly tailored suit, very short beard, plus fez. So it is not so much about against the modern or for the modern, how these people decide to dress. It's various aspects, various blends they actually use. What happens if you look at Salonica? Now, this is 1917. Actually, it's not an Ottoman town anymore by this time. You see, they obviously they stayed abreast with developments in architecture. This is the recent Art Nouveau style. You find the Olympia cinema built in. And what do people actually go to see? If you can see the signs for the movies these people are queuing up for. One of them is in French, L'homme qui assassina, which actually is a French play, but the action takes place in Istanbul. And once again, you can see a man with a fez on one of the posters hanging there. Plus an American movie, Hearts of the West. And although this is occupied Salonica, 1917, you do not actually see many French or British soldiers in the audience. You see a lot of people dressed in civil clothes. You see a lot of women. You see a lot of girls with their white bonnets sticking out of the crowd. So you see these people still have an interest in topics which center around Istanbul. They easily deal with English or French films. That is part of their world. And same goes for early 20th century Istanbul. You see more adventures into modern architecture, Art Nouveau architecture, this building by the Wiener Bankenverein, this mosque, which is definitely very experimental. And if you switch here to the right of the screen, you will see advertisement, not only in French letters, but you also see Ottoman Arabic, you see Cyrillic letters, Armenian letters. Here to this side, you might catch faintly Latin and Greek letters. So these were highly diverse places, and it's actually kind of strange that for most of us, they seem kind of exotic when you look at them today. They look different than you would if you would look at a 100-year-old photograph of Piccadilly Circus or Unter den Linden or Champs-Élysées. They are not in the center of a history book on Turkey, Southeast Europe, or whatever. They are somehow relegated to our slightly exoticist field of Ottoman urban history or urban history of Ottoman cities. So I think while I said this is in part due to historiography, you could go back quite a way. You could trace it to Karl Marx, to Max Weber, from whom I have a quote here, past Bernard Lewis or Emanuel Wallerstein, this general idea that cities outside of Europe are not very interesting, that the Ottoman Empire, the Eastern Mediterranean as a whole, is an agricultural society. We don't have to concern ourselves with these cities. They are, if you look at this quote by Max Weber, strictly speaking, they're boring. But I would say this is an attitude we have to counter to some degree, because it continues to inform some ideas people have about these societies until today. And in order to do that, we have to tackle these more classic, more big issues of modern history, and one of them is Europeanization. So I was asking myself, what can I do differently if I touch on the topic of Europeanization by going through these approaches of urban history, cultural history? And on the one hand, I obviously choose different phenomena to analyze. But apart from that, I tried to take a few frameworks in order to make sure I have a different perspective on the whole thing. And one of the frameworks is definitely the city. I don't want to write a history of the Ottoman Empire, not that there is no Ottoman Empire in this. So I take the city seriously as a space, an urban arena in which these decisions, what Europeanization looks like, are fought out or experimented, tried out, perhaps discarded, perhaps changed in the process. Part of that means trying to take the people in the city seriously, no matter what kind of nationality or ethnic identity they had. This is, on the one hand, one could think it's just political correctness. It's not about that. It's about actually trying to understand this particular culture, which was created in this period, without a priori thinking like, oh, this is something Greek, this is something Armenian or whatever. First of all, and to also allow for several of the residents who do not have Ottoman nationality to be seen as part of this urban culture, because they were important, as I could tell from my work, especially with Habsburg consular material. Second, Europe is on the one hand the object, or strictly speaking, Europeanization is the object of my study, but it's also one of the perspectives. A lot of people in this time considered the Eastern Mediterranean, or at least their respective city, a corner of Europe. That's one contemporary quote, Vefi Khalid Karay, but in different ways you could find it a lot in local press and whatnot. What difference does that make? We tend to think of the Ottoman Empire as the antithesis of Europe, Orient, Occident, whatever. But I think that in many ways we can actually learn more by seeing some of the tendencies we notice as part of some trans-European continuity, not that things in the Ottoman Empire were not different than elsewhere, but if you would study the history of Portugal or the history of Ireland, you would also have to say, yes, some things were different. Plus we are in history in general beyond the point where, at least on a theoretical level, we always consider that we have one European norm. And third, I try to take the Mediterranean dimension of this seriously, trying to see the Mediterranean as a space where asymmetric relationships and shared experiences among Europe, the Maghreb, and the Middle East were experienced. That's a literal quote from Sakis Gekas and Manuel Boruta. Plus, in my sources, I try to keep a balance. I try to actually mix rather freely between different layers of sources, different types of sources relating to different social strata and actions rather than the written word. So then I have these, as Nazan has already said, I have these different sections on space, entertainment, identities, and then how it all came crashing down. I'll try and skim briefly over it and rest perhaps a little bit more with the aspect of identities if time allows us. So first, the question of space in a more narrow sense of the word. Space, the imagined and the constructed space of the Mediterranean cities. What was it determined by? Well, to start with the Mediterranean, as of 1798, we have the situation that the Napoleonic forces actually defeat the Ottoman forces in Egypt rather quickly. However, and from then on, it's kind of known that the Ottoman Empire is not a military might anymore. It could be forced to release its part of the Mediterranean. However, as we all know, that does not happen immediately. For over 100 years, this region still remains by majority Ottoman, a few colonial colonies in the Ottoman territories notwithstanding. So what do you have? You have the state, which no longer is the imperial might people listen to, as when it comes towards conceptualizing this region, thinking about what the future holds. On the other hand, you do not have a one single new power. Instead, you have several great powers which try to sort of balance each other out in the region. That's absolutely nothing new. You've heard that probably before. But the question I try to answer is, what does that do to the level of ideology? How is this ideological gap filled once Pax Ottomana has disappeared? And there I found that actually this is more or less what takes its place, the European dream. From Napoleon landing in Egypt via other initiatives by the French embassy in Constantinople in this period, until the eve of World War I. In some ways, people have repeated, reiterated, reformulated a promise to the population of the Ottoman Empire, namely, that there is a world out there the Ottoman Empire could be part of, a community of cultured nations, as it's called in one source by Martin Hartmann, or other visions here, a few random ones from around 1860. Now, I find that it's important to consider this something different than the white man's burden or other forms of cultural mission, civilizing mission to the Western powers. This is actually holding out this idea you can be part of the winners of this 19th century process of change if you perform, if you work on it, if you engage with commerce, if you adapt the cultural fads emanating out of Western Europe. This is kind of the message this European dream brings across. It's very debatable, of course, who, when, where meant this, and when was this just a phrase being dished out to sort of pacify the locals. That's something I don't have to resolve as a whole. What is important to remember, the locals, they seized upon this. You see in this list of quotes, Mehmet Reşit Pasha, a governor, Wali of Aydın at the time, but not only elites, you will find also locals who would, from middle class, for example, who would say, yes, this is what we want. We don't want Europeanization only to be recognized on a par with the others. We want it for, in order to process change in a way which allows us to live in our cities today in the way we would want to. And one aspect where this, where you see sort of a solidification of this idea is the quest for urban space. Part of this desire for Europeanization affected the question, how are cities supposed to look like? And people were rather unhappy with the seafront, waterfront image their cities gave. As you can see here in 1860s Smyrna, these ramshackle warehouses are not the best postcard image of a city you could hope for. So there are long discussions in this period. There's obviously also economic interests, state interests in changing this situation, but it is also an initiative for beautification of the cities. And it's after some long struggles I won't go into here, the the seafront, the waterfront is actually changed to according to modern norms of regularity, symmetry, beauty, and efficiency of transport. And from these regularized spaces, new sociabilities actually evolve, especially one of the main activities, the Volta or Corso, meaning getting dressed up in chic attire, going up and down the waterfront at sunset, something which is still being done in some countries around the Eastern Mediterranean until today. Which leads me to the second topic I wanted to touch on, entertainment. Now, while many activities in some form already existed, especially among foreigners from overseas, several cultural forms start to expand and start to be enjoyed by quite a number of other locals as well. And I'll try to rather briefly skim through this. I've touched on this in a couple of other presentations. Society balls are an important event in all of these cities throughout the period. Opera, theaters in general, but especially opera, become an obsession, you might say. I speak in the book of opera mania, actually from around the middle of the 19th century onwards. This includes, precipitates a strong exchange, meaning artists traveling actually from Italy, from France, from other places, musicians, stage builders, all kinds of forms of exchange which take place here. And a third field I want to mention here, beer, hardly known on the Eastern Mediterranean at the beginning of the 19th century, becomes at least its #2 drink. And this, on the one hand, affects upscale places, as we see here, the Viennese beer house in Constantinople, Pera, known also simply as Yannis, according to its owner's name, but also other varieties where, including beer gardens, where these things are not as upper class, nor as male, nor as fancy as we've seen it in the other picture. This is drinking beer is one sign, just like opera and taking part in balls, where people show their openness to change on the one hand, but also other things, including forms of cultural capital, or obviously, also forms of interethnic harmony, especially the balls are an important site for that, and intergender sociability, something where the 19th century offers new possibilities at the time. So now, if I have a few more minutes, I believe I do, I'll go a little bit more into the aspect of identities, one of the central issues of, obviously, when talking about the 19th century, and you'll have to briefly excuse me fiddling around with the screen a little bit because I want to play you a short extract from a song which I find helpful for understanding the particularity of identities in this period. So what is this song about? You have to imagine it on the streets of Smyrna before the Great Fire of 1922. A man approaches a woman, asks her are you Turkish? Are you Greek? Or are you English or French? You're so beautiful. And from this very aggressive sort of pass this man makes, this woman, of course, has to retort somehow, push him back verbally in some way. And she says, like, what is it to you whether I live in Menemen or in Cordelio, which are two different suburbs of Izmir? And I will wear my shalvar, so my traditional baggy pants, you might say, any way I like. And any color I like, it's up to me, sort of. So yeah, why are we dealing, when we're trying to talk about identities on the Eastern Mediterranean shore, with the songs of a which might have been sung in some bars in this period, which probably nobody took too seriously? Well, this is actually something which I find significant for this period, this whole aspect of ambivalence. This man wants to know the ethnicity of the woman he finds attractive, but he never manages to make her actually say, I am the one or the other. Also, we are not quite sure, does this woman actually defend her honor just out of show, so it doesn't seem like she's too much interested in this person? Or is she really turned off by this guy and tries to fend him off? All of these things are sort of in flow in this song. And that, I think, is something rather particular to this period as a whole. And I found, like, when I tried to find other examples of how people have a more fluid identity, of course, we have a lot of discourse to the contrary, but I found a couple of names here in Protestant and Catholic baptism registers, and they're all from the beginning of the 20th century. And you can see that some people have started to like to mix, to have an Italian Arabic name, or a German Greek name, or German Turkish, as in the last two examples. There are some people in this period who identify positively in some way with mixed cultures, with mixed identities. Is the topic of mixed identities, in-betweenness, is this something new? I could definitely not claim so. In fact, this has been reflected upon a lot in contemporary literature too, and in later writings. Sheriff Mardin draws our attention to the novel Araba Sevdası, Love of Carriages, by Recaizade Mahmud Ekrem, which was first published in 1896. And he sees the main character, Bihruz Bey, as exemplary of a certain situation, something contemporaries see as a malaise, a feeling of uneasiness, of things not being quite right. What is this Bihruz Bey syndrome? It's a form of arrested development, you might say, between East and West, modern, unmodern, whatever. Bihruz Bey, for example, in trying to attract the attention of these ladies, tries to translate first Persian poetry, then French poetry. Neither one of them does he manage. Neither one of them comes out right. He has a high interest in material things, modern dress, the canes, the coats he wears, and such things. He despises the simple rural people of his times. This is a character default, sort of, Mahmud Ekrem wanted to draw attention to, and which you can find in other examples of the literature. However, while I think Sheriff Mardin's observations are absolutely correct, I would say that we can actually take this a step further if we try to see this not as a phenomenon of Easterners facing the West, but rather of a situation which reflects to some part what people were going through all over Europe, if not all over the world in this period of time. And that's where I found this quote by Moritz Czaki, or his writings in general, very helpful. He reflects here on the Habsburg cities in the 19th century as multicultural sites, and draws the writings of several contemporary authors. He draws on them in order to understand this feeling people had of in-betweenness, of lack of qualities. Robert Musil's man without qualities is this is sort of the stereotypical character in these writings. People who are I don't know, bombarded by different possibilities the modern world offers to them, but then in the end, never really make it to act upon the possibilities which they are confronted with. Instead, as you can see in this caricature or in this cartoon version of Robert Musil's Mann ohne Eigenschaften, the guy sits in or lies in bed and fantasizes about stuff in the world based upon his reading. So this is something I find it rather helpful to look at some German language authors to try and understand things which also affect people in the urban centers along the Eastern Mediterranean. And one of the characters I actually find helpful here is Friedrich Nietzsche. And if you look at this short passage, I think what he's describing is something akin to what Bihruz Bey or Robert Musil experienced in later decades, this feeling that there is so many different morals, so many different arts, so many different aspects bombarding you that you are, as an individual, no longer able to act upon them. Even if there are great changes in your time, you end up sitting there and sort of contemplating things and not really being part of the action. So what do you do if you're afflicted by this malaise, the Bihruz Bey Syndrome, or the this being with a person without qualities? Friedrich Nietzsche's suggestion was, well, we cannot take this transitional period we live in seriously, but what we can do is try to make the most of those freedoms we have. The fact that everything is in flux, the fact that things are one day have certain values, next day are seen differently. To sort of go out there, enjoy it as much as you can. And that is what I kind of see in that brief song I played to you performed by Muammer Ketengiolu. Are there more examples of this? Yes, you can find them. One very interesting discussion I found was in the Journal de Salonique, in a series from 1895 to early 1896, this French language newspaper of Salonica. What are they discussing? The quality of men and women in Salonica. The discussion is kicked off by the editor-in-chief, Vitalis Cohen, writing under his pen name Sheridan. I've left it in the French original here. I hope a number of you can understand the gist of it anyways. He describes the young women, the young unmarried women of Salonica as the 11th plague, which Moses forgot to strike Egypt with, showing all their unrealized dreams and suppressed desires and desires for a husband. And at the end of this lengthy, very sexist satire, what does he suggest to do? Well, we have all of these brunettes from our town. We might as well sell them off to the Mormons in Salt Lake City because they can have 50 women, so we can be rid of them. Pretty sexist, but we know in the media today as well, this kind of provocation will get you readers, will get you retorts, will keep you in the conversation. And Vitalis Cohen knew that. Nonetheless, I think even the editors of the paper were surprised for how many weeks letters would continue to pour in on this one subject. In the next issue, we have a letter to the editor by a young lady, as her pseudonym says. And she sort of retorts by going the opposite way, saying like, okay, if we as the young women of Salonica look so long at the marriage bazaar, it is because we find very few able candidates here. This is a city of commerce. These people cannot stop talking about anything else but their business. They do not exercise their bodies. They do not exercise their minds. There's no intellectual, poetic, idealist activity. When we have to go dancing with them, they tire easily and they don't know how to dance because they never bothered to learn how. And because of this, the interest in these men is low. The next, a male writer pitches in saying like, yes, it's true, our city is full of commerce, and it's so difficult, but how could we exercise our bodies? You can't even ride a bicycle in this town because your bicycle gets stuck in the mud because there are not properly paved streets. And next, another man writes and says like, okay, but what's the charm in these women anymore? Everybody has a piano and even the servant personnel dresses as if they're baronesses. So I'm going to enjoy my bachelor life a little bit longer, but I do see that I should, in such a case, help my sister and my mother with the household. So this very quaint, very middle-class kind of discussion, what can we read from that? I think this is a straightforward discussion about contemporary gender roles. People are unhappy with their respective gender roles, the ones there are ascribed. But as becomes apparent, these people do not manage to make the decisive step, to make the most out of what they've been reading in their French novels, in these newspapers, which are supposedly a window to the wider world, just as Robert Musil's Man Without Qualities. They kind of end up in bed just reflecting on the possibilities of the modern world, still hoping that someday the knight in shining armor or the femme fatale will come and sort of grab their hand, take them out of this stuck up, boring Salonica and lead them into the promises the modern world actually holds out there. So in some ways, this is a reflection on a malaise, on this feeling as well. What I find very interesting is that it does not come out of this advice literature, which we know a lot of for the late Ottoman period, but that it is more something closer to actually the everyday life people experience in Salonica in this period. And then by looking at some other publications, I've tried to sort of find out where do people in this period actually end up feeling these similar feelings of inequity, and where do people actually manage to step out and to get this feeling that they are on top of things, that according to Nietzsche's statements, they manage to live in the light, making the most of the weird transitional period they live in. And on the one hand, some of the outlets you see, Katja Jana lists cross-dressing as one thing, not dressing perfectly Ottoman, not dressing perfectly Western, but coming up with these weird in-between combinations. Secil Yilmaz talks, gives us examples of how a doctor finds medicinal discourse a kind of excuse to speak out openly about sexual intercourse in bourgeois society, because this is a kind of vehicle that allows for it. Murat Yildiz has used gymnasts as an example of how people manage to break out of their prescribed gender roles. But you might say, I would say unfortunately, or some may say thank God, there are a lot of discourses in this period usually tied to nation building projects or to the project of creating a bourgeoisie as a community of sentiment, following certain cultural rules, where people are instructed to stay away from what is considered the excesses, these too liberal spirits. And I see them standing sort of against this, free spirit, free-minded way of trying to get out there, deal with the modern world, to try to always say, like, yes, okay, we might need modern math, modern foreign languages, but then we need to sort of focus on our community, on family values, and the whole spiel. Once again, I don't have time to go into that, but I think a number of you will know the kind of literature I'm referring to. The last major section of the book then tries to deal with the disintegration of this particular period in time where this urban culture came to flourishing by, on the one hand, anti-European discourses, but also by a kind of angry young man and angry young women, which Pankaj Mishra speaks about in his Age of Anger. I find that actually a very helpful, useful way to address the Ottoman dismemberment or unraveling of the port cities too, and of the subsequent nationalization of space, which you see two examples of here in Izmir and Salonica on the waterfront in the former city centers, respectively. So with that, I try to draw to a close of what this impression I try to give you of the book, and am very much looking forward to your comments, questions, and criticism. Thank you very much.